In the quiet moments between dawn and sunrise, when the world holds its breath before beginning another day, Sarah Mitchell had developed a ritual that helped her gather strength for whatever lay ahead. She would sit by her bedroom window with a cup of tea that often grew cold in her trembling hands, watching the sky slowly lighten while mentally preparing herself for another day of being a mother, a fighter, and a woman determined not to let cancer define the final chapters of her story. What she could never have prepared for was how a simple parking ticket would lead her to an encounter that would remind her that compassion still existed in the world, delivered from the most unexpected source. At 38 years old, Sarah should have been in the prime of her life, juggling the beautiful chaos of raising her two young children while building the marketing career she had worked so hard to establish. Instead, she was fighting stage 3 breast cancer with the same fierce determination she had once applied to client presentations and school fundraisers, except now the stakes were infinitely higher and the battlefield was her own body. The diagnosis had come 18 months earlier, delivered by an oncologist whose kind eyes couldn't soften the brutal reality of the words that would divide Sarah's life into before and after. The treatment regimen that followed had been as exhausting as it was necessary. Rounds of chemotherapy that left her nauseated and weak, radiation therapy that burned her skin and sapped her energy, and surgical procedures that had required weeks of recovery time she couldn't really afford to take. Through it all, Sarah had maintained a brave face for her children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jack, who had watched their vibrant mother transform into someone who needed frequent naps and couldn't always keep up with their boundless energy. Sarah's husband David had been supportive in his own way, but the diagnosis had revealed cracks in their marriage that neither of them had been prepared to address. The stress of her illness, combined with mounting medical bills and the emotional toll of watching someone you love battle a disease that might win, had created a distance between them that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. David threw himself into work as a way of coping, often staying late at the office to avoid the reality of what was happening at home, leaving Sarah to navigate the daily challenges of cancer treatment while also being the primary caregiver for their children. The financial impact of Sarah's illness had been devastating in ways that health insurance couldn't fully address. While her policy covered most of the major medical expenses, the countless smaller costs had accumulated into a mountain of debt that kept Sarah awake at night even when the cancer treatments didn't. Co-pays for specialist visits, prescription medications not fully covered by insurance, the special foods her oncologist recommended to help maintain her strength, parking fees at the hospital during her twice-weekly treatments, these expenses had drained their savings and forced them to make difficult choices about everything from groceries to utility bills. Sarah had been forced to take extended leave from her marketing position, which meant losing not only her salary but also the sense of professional identity and accomplishment that had been such an important part of who she was. The disability payments she received were a fraction of her regular income, barely enough to cover the mortgage payment, let alone the additional expenses that came with her medical care. She had applied for various assistance programs and grants, but the bureaucratic maze of paperwork and waiting periods had been overwhelming for someone already exhausted from fighting for her life. The parking ticket that would eventually bring Sarah to Judge Caprio's courtroom had been issued during one of her chemotherapy sessions at Rhode Island Hospital. The treatments typically took 4 to 6 hours, depending on how her body responded to the medications, and parking in the hospital garage cost $15 per day, a seemingly small amount that had become a significant expense when multiplied by dozens of treatment visits. On the day in question, Sarah had discovered that her wallet contained only $12, $3 short of the parking fee. Faced with the choice between missing her chemotherapy appointment and parking illegally, Sarah had made the decision that any mother battling cancer would make. She parked in a nearby residential area with time restrictions, hoping that her treatment would be completed before the time limit expired. But chemotherapy doesn't adhere to parking schedules, and when Sarah's body had reacted poorly to the medications, requiring additional monitoring and fluids, her treatment had extended well beyond the posted time limits. When Sarah finally emerged from the hospital 6 hours later, weak from the chemotherapy and dreading the drive home in her compromised state, she found the bright orange parking ticket tucked under her windshield wiper. The $45 fine might as well have been $400 given their current financial situation, but worse than the money was what the ticket represented. Another system that didn't account for the reality of what people like her were going through, another bureaucratic obstacle in a life that had already become overwhelmingly complicated. In the weeks leading up to her court date, Sarah had considered simply paying the fine to avoid the stress of appearing in court, but $45 was money they desperately needed for other expenses. She had also considered ignoring the ticket entirely, but she knew that would only compound the problem with additional fees and potential complications that she couldn't afford to deal with. So she had made the decision to appear in court, hoping that she might be able to explain her situation and perhaps get the fine reduced or dismissed. The morning of her court appearance, Sarah had undergone her chemotherapy treatment just 2 days earlier, and she was still feeling the effects of the powerful medications coursing through her system. She had tied a colorful scarf around her head to cover the hair loss that had been one of the most visible reminders of her battle with cancer, and she had applied makeup carefully to disguise the pallor and exhaustion that had become her constant companions. She wanted to appear as normal as possible, not because she was ashamed of her illness, but because she had learned that people often became uncomfortable when confronted with the reality of serious disease. As Sarah sat in the courthouse waiting area that morning, she reflected on how much her life had changed since her diagnosis. The woman who had once confidently presented marketing strategies to corporate executives now felt anxious about explaining her parking violation to a judge. The mother who had once chaperoned field trips and organized playdates now struggled to have enough energy to help her children with homework. The wife who had once planned romantic dinners and weekend getaways now existed in a relationship strained by the weight of serious illness and financial stress. But Sarah Mitchell was still a fighter, even when fighting had become the hardest thing she had ever done. She had faced down chemotherapy sessions that left her violently ill, had endured surgical procedures that required weeks of recovery, and had maintained her role as a mother even when her own body felt like it was betraying her at every turn. A parking ticket and a court appearance were just 2 more challenges in a life that had become an endless series of obstacles to navigate, and she was determined to face them with the same grace and strength she had tried to bring to everything else. The journey that had led Sarah Mitchell to her current battle with cancer began 2 years earlier with a discovery that millions of women make each year, yet one that never fails to shatter the normalcy of everyday life. During a routine self-examination in the shower, something her doctor had encouraged her to do monthly but that she often forgot in the busy rush of managing work and family, Sarah had felt a small, hard lump in her left breast that hadn't been there before. Her first instinct had been denial, the hope that it was just a cyst or some benign growth that would disappear on its own with time. For 2 weeks, Sarah had convinced herself that the lump was nothing serious, checking it obsessively each day and trying to persuade herself that it was getting smaller or softer. She had read articles online about fibrous tissue and hormonal changes, grasping at any explanation that didn't involve the word that terrified every woman. But the lump remained, unchanged and undeniable, until finally her sister Jennifer had insisted that Sarah make an appointment with her gynecologist for a proper examination. The initial doctor's visit had led to a mammogram, which led to an ultrasound, which led to a biopsy that required Sarah to wait 5 agonizing days for results while trying to maintain her normal routine of work meetings and children's activities. She had told David about the lump and the tests, but they had both agreed not to worry the children until they knew more. Those 5 days had been among the longest of Sarah's life, filled with moments of hope alternating with waves of terror as she imagined the worst possible outcomes. When Dr. Martinez called with the biopsy results, Sarah had been sitting in her car outside Emma's elementary school, waiting for the dismissal bell. The words, invasive ductal carcinoma, had hit her like a physical blow, and she had found herself struggling to breathe as the oncologist's voice continued explaining staging and treatment options and survival statistics. Sarah had written down the information mechanically, her handwriting shaking as she tried to process the reality that her life had just fundamentally changed. The initial staging tests had revealed that Sarah's cancer was stage 3, meaning it had spread to nearby lymph nodes but hadn't yet metastasized to distant organs. Her oncologist had explained that this was serious but treatable, with survival rates that were encouraging if she responded well to aggressive treatment. The recommended protocol would include neoadjuvant chemotherapy to shrink the tumor, followed by surgery, and then additional chemotherapy and radiation to eliminate any remaining cancer cells. The conversation with David that evening had been one of the most difficult of their marriage. Sarah had waited until after the children were in bed, then had sat him down at their kitchen table and delivered the news that would change all of their lives forever. David's reaction had been to immediately shift into problem-solving mode, researching treatment options and insurance coverage and second opinions. While Sarah appreciated his practical approach, she had also felt a sense of emotional distance that would only grow wider as her treatment progressed. Telling Emma and Jack about her diagnosis had required careful thought and planning. Sarah and David had decided to be honest but age-appropriate, explaining that Mommy was sick and would need special medicine that might make her tired and cause her hair to fall out, but that the doctors were very good at helping people get better. Emma, always perceptive, had asked immediately if Sarah was going to die, a question that had left both parents struggling for reassurance they weren't entirely sure they could provide. The first round of chemotherapy had been worse than Sarah had expected, despite all the preparation and warnings from her medical team. The nausea had been overwhelming, lasting for days after each treatment and making it impossible to eat the nutritious foods her body needed to maintain strength. The fatigue had been unlike anything she had ever experienced, not just tiredness, but a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel monumental. Worst of all had been the emotional side effects, the depression and anxiety that seemed to magnify every small problem into an insurmountable crisis. As the treatments continued, Sarah had watched her body change in ways that affected her sense of identity and femininity. Her thick, dark hair had fallen out in clumps, first gradually and then all at once, leaving her bald and feeling exposed and vulnerable. The mastectomy, when it came, had required her to grieve not just for the loss of her breast but for the way cancer had invaded and altered her physical self. Even with reconstruction surgery planned for after her treatment was complete, Sarah struggled with feeling like the body she had inhabited for 38 years was no longer fully her own. The financial impact of her illness had been swift and devastating. Sarah's health insurance covered the major medical expenses, but the countless smaller costs had accumulated quickly. Co-pays for oncologist visits were $40 each time, and she was seeing specialists twice a week during active treatment. The anti-nausea medications that made chemotherapy tolerable cost over $300 per month, even with insurance. Special foods recommended to help maintain her nutrition during treatment, supplements to support her immune system, and the various comfort items that made her recovery periods more bearable all added up to expenses they had never budgeted for. Even more challenging had been the loss of Sarah's income when she was forced to take extended medical leave from her marketing position. The company had been understanding and had held her job as long as legally required, but the short-term disability payments she received were only 60% of her regular salary. For a family that had been living comfortably on 2 incomes, the sudden reduction to essentially 1.5 incomes, combined with dramatically increased medical expenses, had created a financial crisis that compounded the emotional and physical challenges of cancer treatment. David had picked up extra freelance projects to try to make up some of the lost income, but this meant he was working longer hours and was home even less often. Sarah understood the financial necessity of his additional work, but she also felt increasingly isolated and overwhelmed by the daily demands of managing her treatment schedule while also caring for 2 young children who needed consistency and reassurance during one of the most frightening periods of their lives. The day Sarah received her parking ticket had been particularly difficult because her oncologist had warned her that this round of chemotherapy might be harder than previous ones. Her blood counts had been lower than ideal, which meant her immune system was compromised and her body was showing signs of the cumulative effects of months of aggressive treatment. The treatment itself had indeed been more challenging, with Sarah experiencing severe nausea and dizziness that required her to remain in the infusion center for additional monitoring and 4 fluids. When she had finally been cleared to leave the hospital that day, Sarah had felt physically and emotionally drained. The drive home had been difficult, with waves of nausea forcing her to pull over twice to compose herself before continuing. Finding the parking ticket on her windshield had felt like the final straw in a day that had already tested her limits, a reminder that the world continued to function according to its normal rules even when her personal world had been turned upside down by illness. In the days following the ticket, Sarah had found herself crying over seemingly small things: spilled milk, a misplaced shoe, a child's innocent question about when mommy would feel better. The parking fine had become a symbol of everything that felt unfair and overwhelming about her situation, another burden in a life that already felt impossibly heavy. She knew that $45 shouldn't make such a difference when she was fighting for her life, but the reality was that every dollar mattered when medical bills were piling up and income had been dramatically reduced. "Sarah Mitchell," the court clerk announced, and Sarah rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate and careful as she had learned to be since beginning chemotherapy. The colorful headscarf she wore had been a gift from her sister Jennifer, chosen specifically because its bright floral pattern was supposed to make her feel more like herself, though Sarah wasn't entirely sure who that person was anymore. As she walked toward Judge Caprio's bench, she was acutely aware of how different she looked from the confident marketing professional she had been just 2 years earlier, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find strength in the most unlikely circumstances. Judge Caprio looked up as Sarah approached, immediately noticing something that his years of experience had taught him to recognize: the careful way she moved, the pale complexion that spoke of serious illness, and most tellingly, the headscarf that he had seen worn by countless other women who had appeared in his courtroom while battling cancer. His expression softened slightly as their eyes met, and Sarah felt a moment of relief at seeing kindness rather than impatience or judgment in his gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by millions. "Please, take your time. How are you feeling today?" The question went beyond mere courtesy. There was genuine concern in his tone that caught Sarah off guard and made her realize that this judge was seeing her as a person rather than just another case to process. "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice slightly hoarse from the medications she was taking. "I'm doing as well as can be expected, given the circumstances." She had practiced being brief and factual, not wanting to burden the court with her personal struggles, but something in Judge Caprio's demeanor suggested that he was genuinely interested in her well-being. Judge Caprio glanced at the paperwork before him, noting the parking violation details, but when he looked back at Sarah, his focus was entirely on her as a human being. "Mrs. Mitchell, I see you're here about a parking citation. Can you tell me what happened that day?" Sarah took a breath, organizing her thoughts carefully. She had rehearsed this explanation, trying to find a balance between taking responsibility for the violation and explaining the circumstances that had led to it. "Your Honor, I was parked illegally in a residential area while I was receiving chemotherapy treatment at Rhode Island Hospital. I know I was in violation of the posted time limits, and I take responsibility for that." The simple mention of chemotherapy caused a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more focused and compassionate. Around the courtroom, other people waiting their turns seemed to grow quieter, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a routine parking violation. "You were receiving chemotherapy?" Judge Caprio asked, his voice gentle but concerned. "Can you tell me more about your situation, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah had not expected the judge to ask for details about her medical condition, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed by the kindness in his tone. "I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer 18 months ago, Your Honor. I'm currently going through aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, surgery, radiation. The day I got the ticket, my treatment ran longer than expected because I had some complications, and I couldn't get back to my car within the posted time limits." Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. In his decades on the bench, he had encountered many people facing medical crises, but there was something particularly moving about this young mother who was clearly fighting for her life while also trying to fulfill her responsibilities and follow the law. "Mrs. Mitchell, may I ask why you weren't parked in the hospital parking garage?" This question touched on one of the most difficult aspects of Sarah's situation: the financial burden that her illness had placed on her family. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as she prepared to explain something that felt deeply personal and humiliating. "Your Honor, the hospital parking costs $15 per day, and my treatments happen twice a week. With all of our medical expenses and the fact that I've had to take leave from work, we're struggling financially. That day, I only had $12 in my wallet, so I couldn't afford the parking fee." The courtroom fell completely silent as everyone absorbed the profound impact of what Sarah had just shared. Here was a woman fighting cancer who couldn't afford $15 to park legally while receiving life-saving treatment. Judge Caprio felt a familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he encountered situations that revealed the harsh realities faced by people dealing with serious illness. "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge said softly, "how long have you been dealing with this illness?" 18 months now, Your Honor. I've had 6 months of chemotherapy, a mastectomy, and I'm currently doing additional chemo before starting radiation therapy. The doctors say I'm responding well to treatment, but it's been..." Sarah's voice trailed off as she searched for words to describe the indescribable challenge of fighting cancer while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life for her children. Judge Caprio noticed the slight tremor in Sarah's hands and the way she occasionally swayed slightly as she stood, signs that suggested she was not feeling well even as she tried to appear strong. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you here alone today? Do you have someone with you?" "Yes, Your Honor, I drove myself. My husband is at work, and we didn't want to disrupt the children's school day for something like this." Sarah's answer revealed another layer of the isolation and burden she was carrying, facing this court appearance alone while David focused on earning income they desperately needed and trying to maintain normalcy for Emma and Jack. "How are your children handling your illness?" Judge Caprio asked, his question coming from his own experience as a father and grandfather who understood how devastating serious illness could be for entire families. Sarah's composure wavered for the first time since entering the courtroom. "They're 8 and 6, Your Honor. They've been incredibly brave, but it's hard for them to understand why Mommy is sick so often and can't do all the things we used to do together. My 8-year-old Emma sometimes tries to take care of me, which breaks my heart because she should just be worrying about homework and friends, not whether her mother is going to be okay." The emotion in Sarah's voice as she spoke about her children was evident to everyone in the courtroom. Judge Caprio felt his own eyes beginning to moisten as he imagined this young mother trying to maintain strength for her children while battling a disease that was attacking her very survival. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said, standing up from his bench in a gesture that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present, "I want you to know that what you're going through requires incredible courage and strength. The fact that you're here today, taking responsibility for a parking violation while you're fighting cancer and caring for 2 young children, tells me everything I need to know about your character." Sarah looked up at the judge in surprise, not having expected such personal recognition of her struggles. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just try to do the right thing, even when everything feels overwhelming." Judge Caprio's expression grew even more compassionate as he prepared to respond to Sarah's case in a way that would surprise everyone present, including Sarah herself. Judge Caprio stood behind his bench for a long moment, looking at Sarah Mitchell with an expression that conveyed both deep respect and profound sadness for what she was enduring. In his 3 decades of presiding over municipal court, he had encountered countless people facing difficult circumstances, but there was something about Sarah's quiet dignity in the face of such overwhelming challenges that touched him more deeply than he had expected. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine emotion and moral conviction. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Caprio began, his voice stronger and more passionate than it had been moments earlier, "I want everyone in this courtroom to understand what we're witnessing here today. We have before us a young mother who is fighting for her life, caring for 2 small children, dealing with devastating financial pressures, and yet she still came to court to take responsibility for a parking violation that occurred while she was receiving cancer treatment." The judge's words seemed to resonate through the courtroom, and Sarah noticed that other people waiting for their cases had stopped their quiet conversations and were listening intently to what was unfolding before them. She felt simultaneously grateful for the judge's understanding and embarrassed by the public nature of her private struggles. Judge Caprio's expression grew even more intense as he continued. "Mrs. Mitchell, the fact that you couldn't afford $15 to park legally while receiving life-saving treatment is not a failure of character. It's a failure of a system that should be supporting people like you instead of penalizing them. The fact that you're standing here today, taking responsibility despite everything you're going through, shows more integrity and strength than I see from most people who appear before me." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she heard her struggles acknowledged and validated by someone in authority. For months, she had felt like she was drowning in a sea of medical appointments, financial pressures, and family responsibilities, often wondering if she was handling everything correctly or if she was failing everyone who depended on her. But Judge Caprio was far from finished with his unprecedented response to Sarah's case. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not just going to dismiss this parking ticket. I'm going to do something more than that." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out his personal checkbook, a gesture that caused an audible gasp from several people in the courtroom. "Your Honor, you don't have to do that," Sarah said quickly, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I didn't come here asking for charity. I just hoped you might understand my situation." Judge Caprio looked at Sarah with the gentle but firm expression of someone who had made up his mind about something important. "Mrs. Mitchell, this isn't charity. This is community. This is what we do for our neighbors when they're fighting battles that no one should have to fight alone. He began writing in his checkbook as he spoke. I'm writing you a check to cover your parking expenses at the hospital for the next 6 months of your treatment. No mother fighting cancer should have to choose between legal parking and being able to afford groceries for her children. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause as people witnessed this extraordinary act of compassion. Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. She had come to court prepared to pay a fine or perhaps explain her way to a payment plan, never imagining that she would encounter such unexpected kindness from the justice system. But Judge Caprio wasn't done. He turned to address his court clerk while continuing to speak to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to give my clerk your contact information. I'm going to personally reach out to some resources in our community to see what other support might be available for you and your family during your treatment. Sarah's tears were flowing freely now as she struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Your Honor, I don't know what to say. This is more kindness than I ever expected to find here today. Judge Caprio came out from behind his bench, something he rarely did during proceedings, and handed Sarah the check directly. As he did, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Mrs. Mitchell, you have 2 children who need their mother to get better. I want you to focus all your energy on beating this cancer and taking care of your family. Don't waste another moment worrying about parking fees or feeling guilty about things that are beyond your control. Then, speaking louder so the entire courtroom could hear, Judge Caprio delivered words that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today is why our justice system exists, not to punish people who are already struggling, but to recognize human dignity and respond with compassion when compassion is what's needed most. The judge looked directly at Sarah as he continued. Mrs. Mitchell, your strength in facing this illness while caring for your children is an inspiration to everyone in this room. Your willingness to take responsibility, even while dealing with circumstances that would overwhelm most people, shows the kind of character that makes our community stronger. Sarah managed to find her voice despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Your Honor, you've given me more than just help with parking fees. You've given me hope and reminded me that there are still good people in the world who care about others. I will never forget this kindness. Judge Caprio's eyes were visibly moist as he responded. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to remember something. You are not alone in this fight. This community is behind you, your children need you, and everyone in this courtroom is pulling for your complete recovery. He paused, looking around at the other people present. And I want everyone else here to remember Mrs. Mitchell's courage the next time they think they have problems they can't handle. The judge returned to his bench but remained standing as he delivered his final words to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm officially dismissing this parking citation. But more than that, I'm making you a promise. If you need anything during your treatment, anything at all, you call my office directly. We're going to make sure you have the support you need to beat this cancer and be there for your children for many years to come. As Sarah prepared to leave the courtroom, she turned back to Judge Caprio one more time. Your Honor, when I woke up this morning, I was afraid of coming here. I was afraid of being judged and adding another burden to everything I'm already carrying. Instead, I found compassion I never expected and kindness that has restored my faith in humanity. Thank you for seeing me as more than just my circumstances. The standing ovation that followed Sarah's words was unlike anything that had ever been heard in a municipal courtroom. Everyone present, other defendants, court officers, clerks and spectators, rose to their feet to honor this brave woman and the judge who had chosen to respond to her crisis with unprecedented compassion and support. Mother Fighting Cancer finds unexpected compassion. Block 5. The transformation that began in Judge Caprio's courtroom that morning rippled through Sarah Mitchell's life in ways that extended far beyond the practical relief of having her parking expenses covered. As she walked out of the courthouse carrying the judge's check and his personal promise of continued support, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense that she was not facing her battle alone, that there were people in the world who saw her struggle and cared enough to help without being asked. The drive home from the courthouse was unlike any drive Sarah had taken since her diagnosis. Instead of the familiar anxiety and exhaustion that usually accompanied her trips to deal with the various bureaucratic aspects of her illness, She found herself crying tears of relief and gratitude. For the first time in 18 months, someone in authority had looked at her situation and responded not with rules and procedures, but with pure human compassion and practical assistance. When Sarah arrived home, she found David in the kitchen preparing lunch for himself before heading back to work. She had planned to tell him simply that the ticket had been dismissed, but instead found herself recounting the entire extraordinary encounter with Judge Caprio. David listened with amazement as Sarah described the judge's response, the check he had written, and his promise of ongoing support. "I can't believe that really happened," David said, looking at the check that would cover Sarah's parking costs for months to come. "When you left this morning, I was worried about how we were going to pay the fine. I never imagined." His voice trailed off as he seemed to process the magnitude of what Judge Caprio had done for his family. That afternoon, when Emma and Jack came home from school, Sarah sat them down at the kitchen table to share what had happened. She explained it in terms they could understand, that sometimes when people are going through difficult times, other people step forward to help because that's what good people do for each other. Emma, with the perceptiveness that had made her such a support to her mother throughout the cancer journey, asked if this meant that not all adults were too busy to care about their family's problems. "No, sweetheart," Sarah replied, pulling both children close to her on the couch. "There are still very good people in the world who care about others, even when they don't know them personally. Judge Caprio reminded me today that kindness still exists, and that we're not alone in facing hard things." Within days of the video of Sarah's court appearance being shared online, her story had touched millions of viewers around the world. Comments poured in from cancer survivors, healthcare workers, parents, and ordinary people who were moved by the combination of Sarah's quiet dignity and Judge Caprio's extraordinary compassion. Many viewers shared their own stories of unexpected kindness during difficult times, creating a virtual community of support around Sarah's experience. But the impact went beyond social media attention. Local businesses began reaching out to offer assistance to Sarah and her family. A grocery store chain offered to provide weekly deliveries of healthy foods recommended for cancer patients. A local salon specializing in services for women undergoing chemotherapy offered free treatments to help Sarah feel more confident during her recovery. Most meaningfully, other cancer patients and survivors began contacting Sarah to offer friendship, advice, and the kind of understanding that can only come from people who have walked the same difficult path. The Rhode Island Hospital Administration, inspired by the attention Sarah's story brought to the financial challenges faced by patients, implemented a new program providing discounted or free parking for patients receiving long-term treatment. Sarah's experience had inadvertently highlighted a systemic problem that affected thousands of patients, and her story became the catalyst for changes that would benefit countless other families facing similar struggles. 6 months after her court appearance, Sarah returned to Judge Caprio's chambers for a follow-up visit that he had personally requested. The change in her appearance and demeanor was remarkable. Her hair was growing back in soft curls, her complexion had returned to a healthier color, and most notably, she carried herself with the confidence of someone whose treatment was progressing successfully. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said, rising from his desk to greet her warmly, "you look wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Your Honor, I'm doing much better than I dared to hope 6 months ago," Sarah replied, her voice stronger and more vibrant than it had been during their first meeting. "The latest scans show that I'm responding very well to treatment, and my oncologist is optimistic about my prognosis. But more than the medical progress, I want to thank you for what your kindness did for my spirit during one of the darkest periods of my life." Sarah handed Judge Caprio a handwritten letter from Emma and Jack, filled with their childish drawings and heartfelt thanks for helping their mother. "My children wanted you to know that your kindness to me taught them something important about how people should treat each other when someone is struggling." Judge Caprio accepted the letter with visible emotion, scanning the crayon drawings of hearts and flowers alongside Emma's careful writing. "Thank you for helping our mommy when she was scared. You are a hero." "Mrs. Mitchell," the judge said, "what you and your children have taught me is just as valuable as anything I might have done for you. Your courage in facing cancer while raising 2 small children, your dignity in dealing with financial hardship, and your grace in accepting help when it was offered, these qualities remind me why I chose to work in public service." As their visit concluded, Sarah reflected on how profoundly that court appearance had changed her perspective on her cancer journey. Your Honor, when I was diagnosed, I felt like cancer was going to define the rest of my life, however long that might be. But what happened in your courtroom that day reminded me that my illness is just one part of my story, and that how people respond to each other during difficult times is what really matters. 1 year after her court appearance, Sarah Mitchell was declared cancer-free by her oncology team. At her celebration party, surrounded by family and friends, she raised a toast to unexpected kindness from strangers who become friends, and to judges who remember that justice is most powerful when it's delivered with compassion. Sarah's story had become part of Judge Caprio's regular presentations at medical conferences and community events, where he used her experience to illustrate how healthcare systems, legal institutions, and communities could better support people facing serious illness. But more than that, it had become a reminder that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in hospitals or treatment centers, but in moments when one human being chooses to see another person's pain and respond with pure, uncomplicated kindness. The parking ticket that had once seemed like one more burden in an already overwhelming situation had become the vehicle through which Sarah discovered that compassion still existed in the world, that her community cared about her family's well-being, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can restore hope when hope seems lost. Judge Frank Caprio had given Sarah much more than financial assistance for parking fees. He had given her the gift of feeling seen, valued, and supported during the fight of her life, and that gift had made all the difference in her journey toward healing.